deep dive from IsReal News. After the Netanyahu-Trump meeting, the possible paths on Iran. The meeting between Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Donald Trump comes as U.S.-Iran nuclear talks restart, with limited public clarity about what was discussed behind closed doors in Oman. Regional governments are urging de-escalation, while U.S. military posture in the region remains visible. Israeli reporting has described the Netanyahu-Trump conversation as focused primarily on Iran, with a parallel U.S. emphasis on continuing diplomacy in public messaging. Trump has publicly signaled that he is still pursuing negotiations, while Israeli coverage has noted that military planning and defensive preparations can proceed in parallel. In the meeting's wake, several scenarios are being discussed in Israeli analysis and in regional diplomatic reporting. Each depends on the same variables: the scope of the U.S.-Iran talks, the timetable, the sequencing of sanctions relief, and whether missiles and Iran's regional partners are addressed alongside the nuclear program. One scenario is continued negotiations with tighter framing, but no immediate breakthrough. Under this path, Washington keeps the talks going through Oman and other channels, while signaling deadlines and maintaining pressure through sanctions and force posture. Iran continues to insist publicly that the talks focus on the nuclear file, resisting demands for zero enrichment and avoiding discussion of ballistic missiles. Gulf states continue to press for talks to continue, seeking to reduce the chance that the region becomes the battlefield for escalation. A second scenario is a narrow interim understanding that lowers near-term risk but leaves major Israeli concerns unresolved. In Israeli commentary, this is often described as a nuclear-only arrangement. Constraints and monitoring tied to enrichment levels and stockpiles, paired with limited sanctions relief. The Israeli concern, as described in Israeli reporting, is that such a deal could reduce economic pressure on Tehran while leaving the missile program and regional network of armed partners largely outside the framework. In this scenario, Netanyahu's challenge is diplomatic, preserving Israel's freedom of action while avoiding a public rupture with Washington. A third scenario is a breakdown of talks followed by limited military action, paired with a public argument that diplomacy was exhausted. Israeli reporting has described regional expectations that diplomacy may not fully substitute for military options, even as Gulf states try to prevent escalation. In this scenario, the limited character matters. The aim would be a short, bounded strike package intended to degrade specific capabilities rather than a long campaign. Analysts who describe this path also note the constraints: Iran's ability to respond, the risks to shipping and energy infrastructure, and the U.S. interest in avoiding a prolonged war that could destabilize markets and widen the conflict. A fourth scenario is continued negotiations alongside accelerated deterrence steps, with the threat of force used to shape the bargaining space. This is a familiar model in U.S.-Iran diplomacy. Talks proceed, but the U.S. increases naval and air assets and expands sanctions designations. The logic is to convince Tehran that delay has costs, while giving Washington a credible alternative if talks stall. In this scenario, Israel's role is partly intelligence and partly signaling, pressing for a shorter timetable and broader terms, while coordinating on defense against missiles and drones if escalation follows. There is also a regional management scenario that sits underneath all the others: Gulf states and other regional actors working to limit the spillover, even if tensions rise. Recent reporting has highlighted diplomatic efforts by Gulf states to curb escalation risk and, separately, statements suggesting reluctance to be drawn into a strike scenario. This matters because access, overflight, basing, and logistics shape what military options look like in practice, and because regional governments worry about retaliation on their territory and disruption to commerce. Another factor in the near-term calendar is Gaza diplomacy. U.S. reporting indicates the White House is planning a February 19th meeting for a Gaza Board of Peace. intended to advance ceasefire phases and reconstruction funding. Israeli reporting suggests Netanyahu's schedule choices in Washington are being managed with domestic and coalition politics in mind. That broader agenda can influence timing. A major Iran escalation could reshape or derail other U.S. regional initiatives. What to look out for after the Netanyahu-Trump meeting? First, the scope of the next negotiating round. Public language that remains limited to the nuclear file points toward a narrower track. Signals that missiles and regional activity are being raised, whether directly or through sequencing of sanctions relief, point to a broader U.S. ask. Second, the timeline. If U.S. officials begin emphasizing short deadlines, and if force posture in the region continues to build, that suggests Washington is trying to prevent a prolonged process that benefits Iran. Third, the sanctions mechanics. If there is talk of staged relief tied to verified steps, that indicates an attempt to preserve leverage. If relief appears front-loaded, Israeli concerns about downstream financing and regional rebuilding of capabilities will intensify. Fourth, Israel-U.S. coordination cues. Watch for statements about no surprises, joint defensive planning, and intelligence sharing. Those can indicate whether Washington is preparing primarily for diplomacy, primarily for coercion, or for both in parallel. Finally, watch the region's diplomatic traffic. When Gulf and regional capitals intensify mediation efforts, it often reflects heightened concern that miscalculation is rising faster than diplomacy can manage. These are the main pathways being discussed in Israeli and regional reporting as the U.S.-Iran track restarts. The decisive detail will be whether the post-meeting direction produces a deal that changes capabilities or a process that changes timelines without changing the underlying threat. That is the landscape to watch in the hours and days ahead. You've been listening to a deep dive from IsReal News.